Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I am Jonas Holdeman.
And I'm Faithless Forrest. And we want you to know that if you don't believe in God, you're not alone, even in East Tennessee.
Today we're going to discuss Darwin Day. While we go over a few announcements, we invite you to call in to us at the number on the screen. As you call, we have a few announcements of the upcoming activities. Get a pen and paper, and we will give you our email address later in the show.
All right. Well, happy hour with the Atheist Society of Knoxville tonight at Barley's for food and drink. And tomorrow, Wednesday, February 9th, ASK at Rafferty's. Meet at 5:30 and look for the silver jacketed copy of Richard Dawkins' God Delusion standing upright on the table.
The Rationalists of East Tennessee, the next meeting will be the regular monthly book club, Sunday, February 13th, 4 to 6 p.m. at Barnes & Noble on Kingston Pike. We'll be discussing The Genius in All of Us. This deals with nature and nurturing and how it affects intelligence. The next regular RET meeting will be Sunday morning, February 20th, 10:30 to 12:30, and we'll be learning about Knoxville's Community Mediation Center, an organization providing mediation services to individuals and families involved with the judicial system. Finally, this month, we have a Reflections program on Sunday, February 27th. We will be discussing deconversion experiences. There we have a potluck lunch starting at 1 o'clock, discussions 1:30 to 3:30, and for additional details, please visit our website.
All right. And if you have friends that are out of town but who might like to watch our program, now they can. Go to the ctvknox.org website, scroll down about half the page, and you can view the video streaming live.
Viewers, can you call in and tell us how scientists use the word fact, hypothesis, and theory with respect to evolution?
Okie doke. Well, Jonas, I learned about evolution by a combination of my own reading in junior high school and senior high school, in the biology classes as well, where I went to school in Minnesota. I followed this up with reading additional books by popularizers of science, especially Isaac Asimov and Richard Dawkins. How did you learn about evolution?
Well, I went to school in Louisiana, a generation ahead of you.
All right.
We did learn about Mendelian genetics, but not about...
All right.
Oh, look at the camera. R2-D2.
Yeah, no, really.
Okay. Do we have any idea what happened? Was it my face?
It was a power.
Oh, my.
Why don't you let me pick up right here?
All right.
With this. As soon as we're back.
Yeah. All right. Well, viewers, if you're hearing us, we're experiencing technical difficulties here in the studio. We have no video. We can't actually tell if we're on. So, Jonas, I was describing the difference between a fact, which is an observable, a hypothesis, which is an attempt to explain that observable, and a theory, which is the generally accepted explanation. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, let me back up. You were telling how you learned about evolution, and let me make a few comments on that. I think I was always skeptical of the biblical story of creation and wondered where all the water came from to flood the earth. But while in high school, a friend introduced me to a book called Some Mistakes of Moses by the great 19th century iconoclast Robert Ingersoll. Incidentally, that book is still in print.
So you read it that young in age?
As a teenager.
Oh, man, that's great.
This gave me the sense that skepticism is okay and the confidence to be a skeptic.
All right.
It said that skepticism is the greatest enemy of faith. As I began to hear about biological evolution, it just made sense. It explains so much more. The biblical story of Noah explains why there may be seashells on mountaintops, but plate tectonics explains seashells and mountains, earthquakes, volcanoes, and the shape of some continents. I am perhaps a lazy learner and prefer to memorize one rule that explains 100 things rather than 100 rules, each explaining one thing.
Only one thing. Ah, that's great. Well, I especially liked Ingersoll's description of the Ark chapter. His title was kind of underwhelming. He described it as dampness. And he specifically mentioned the dimensions of the Ark.
Oh, wasn't that great?
and then he talked about how it had one window, 22 inches square. Ventilation was obviously a hobby for Jehovah.
So we were going to talk about the terms law, fact, and hypothesis and theory. So do you want to pick up on that?
All right. Well, I was hoping we can get back kind of on schedule here and talk about the fossil record.
Oh.
The fossil record is how people began to understand that life has changed. In fact, the ancient Greeks were aware of fossils, and they many of them felt certain that they were evidence of past life, and that obviously past life was very different. Greece is in an area that is volcanic and mountainous, so they had plenty of opportunities to see fossils well away from the sea. All right.
And so I often wonder if maybe they didn't see fossils of things like dinosaurs, and maybe this is the root of some of the stories about dragons.
Oh,
and
yes.
so on.
Yeah, and well, goodness, some of the best fossil beds these days still come out of China, and China's had traditions of dragons for a long time as well. Well, Jonas, I like to describe evolution using a definition that comes out of a dictionary that my mother got in like 1942. I mean, there we were in the middle of World War II, and my mother had apparently bought this beautiful dictionary. And it describes evolution as an unrolling, as of a scroll. And why I think that's a great image is that it evokes this idea of a story that you can read and you never turn a page. There's no cataclysmic break to it. The story just goes on, flowing from one sentence to another. All right. So we were hoping to have some images of dinosaurs here, the 1830s idea of dinosaurs, which is an interesting mix of both things that are right and things that are a little bit on the fanciful side. But 20 years before the origin of species, the public was just excited about this new learning that they had. So did you have a point there as well?
Oh, faithless. I've lost my place in the script here.
That's all right. So what I guess I'd like to do is talk about how then in 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. And that really changed things because prior to that they had an understanding that life had changed, but they didn't exactly know why. And Darwin explained that whenever creatures reproduce, there's variations. And that variation is not directed. Its direction of variation is random. But that the environment that a creature finds itself in will select some preferentially to the others. Perhaps if the environment is very dry, it will select an organism that's smaller because it has a smaller surface area to lose moisture from.
Well, this whole idea was very troubling to Darwin, as I understand. While he was very confident about his theory and the way the pieces fit together, he still delayed publication of his book quite a while because of his concern about the impact on the society.
How it would be accepted. He felt that, the phrase we use nowadays is extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and he set about acquiring that proof. He did a lot of breeding himself of pigeons, and he became the world's expert on, I think it's pronounced sessile cercipids, barnacles. He dissected lots of barnacles. He said, there's maybe it's just a story, but that he really hates barnacles. But he became the world's expert on them, so that he was to establish partially his authority as well.
Yeah, I understand there was another scientist who was hot on his heels with something very much like the theory of evolution.
Well, yes, indeed, about a generation younger. Was, his name escapes me, of course, was another scientist. Similar story. He got on a ship and he sailed around the world, and he was accumulating facts, and he conceived of the idea of random variation, and then nature selects for improvement or for most fit, and then that represents the new point around which the radiation occurs. And he wrote to Charles Darwin, asking if Charles Darwin thought there was any merit to the idea, and if he would pass it on, I believe, to the Royal Society. So Darwin took his material that he'd been preparing and made a joint presentation at the Royal Society, giving credit to the other scientist also for conceiving the idea.
Quite a test of scientific integrity as well as personal integrity.
Yeah. Both men, remained on good terms, and I think wrote affectionately about one another. We've got, I think, something that we should share with the audience is the last sentence here of the origin of species. So can you read that for us? It starts on the previous line here.
Oh, okay. There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has undergone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
And that's great. That whole point about most beautiful and wonderful forms is echoed even in modern publications. We see here Stephen Jay Gould's book from the late 20th century, begins with the title, Wonderful Life.
The facts which Darwin's theory attempt to explain is the story of the changing life found in the fossil records. What is this image all about?
So, can we get the image? All right.
The tree.
Yeah. We want to back up, I think, a couple images, Sam. We're looking for the image of all the fossil diversity. Yeah, this is the 1830s conception of how the age of the dinosaurs would look like. I'm not even sure the term was widely used then. And some of these creatures are a little bit fanciful, and some of them we now know a lot more about because we have many more examples. All right, so if we could advance a slide or so and get to
the tree.
This shows how Darwin conceived that at various points in a generation there would be offspring, and they would be randomly different.
And isn't this the only illustration in the whole book?
Indeed it is. It is a challenging book to read because there are no pictures, and he makes reference to various plants and animals by genus, species name. And if you're not familiar with them, it can be challenging. But there are illustrated versions of Origin of Species available, and I would recommend one of those. All right. Well, so if we have these species reproducing, and then with variation, and then nature selects changes, especially we get changes as organisms move into new environments. And that leads to a really cool concept called a ring species. And I think we got a slide coming up about that. So a ring species works like this. You see this graphic over my head that from the red to the green represents perhaps a geographic range for species, and that they may vary throughout that. But there occurs some environments where that can actually wrap around, and you'll get two species, or two members of these species that can no longer interbreed, sharing the same region. And that's thought to have actually happened with seagulls in around the Arctic Circle, that they can breed locally around the Arctic Circle, but where they overlap here in Europe, there's two groups that can't breed. I'd encourage the readers to go to Wikipedia and read a little more about that, and learn about how scientists are investigating that to further understand this phenomena. Now,
but we were saying that some individuals thrive better in the economy of nature and leave more offspring. The economy of nature reflects a competition to leave more offspring, the desire to leave more offspring, the scarcity of food, of energy, of places to live, means there will be competition. Sometimes individuals are unable to leave offspring and their line goes extinct. The use of this word economy is deliberately meant to parallel the usage of the same word for the market system, which produces an abundant variety of goods.
And it is kind of ironic that often religious conservatives who so champion the economic free market fail to see the economy of nature market that's going on that produces the variety of species.
Of course, we know that there's a chapter called Variation Under Domestication. People had been domesticating animals, and their forms begin to change from those in the wild. And so tell us about this chapter.
Well, the very first chapter of Origin of Species begins with a discussion of how difficult it is to tell where a species really starts and leaves off. And he makes a fascinating point about how animals in the wild, if you bring them into a zoo, give them plenty of food and the best conditions you can think of, and they become infertile. They can't reproduce. So there's some little difference that we're missing. And you know, there are instances then where we learn what it takes. Maybe it's something unusual in their diet. And so the point being is that if we try to say, it's an attack on the assertion that we can define species as members who are able to interbreed and produce successful offspring, because it's so hard to demonstrate whether or not creatures can produce successful offspring, even when you know when they were taken from the wild, they could have.
Yeah, when creatures develop into a particular niche, both social and natural, and something changes, then disastrous results can happen. I recall the story of the passenger pigeon, where the North American continent was just full of these passenger pigeons, which people started harvesting as if they were buffalo.
Yes.
And so what happened was they went extinct. And the reason it's believed they went extinct is that they would gather in large flocks, and there was all of this raucous noise and behavior that seems to be associated with the mating process. And when their numbers diminished to the point that there was no longer this raucous environment to breed,
they couldn't find mates or mate successfully. Yeah. They fell below a critical mass. Well, Jonas, you, like I know, are an enthusiastic blood donor, and talking about blood donation is an interesting tie-in to this. I'm type A minus. The minus means that I don't have the rhesus factor. And We know that some people who have the rhesus factor was discovered probably when you mix, you do transfusions of different blood types. Bad things can happen to someone who does not have the rhesus factor who receives blood that does have. But that doesn't happen just during transfusions. It can happen in another situation. Do you know the one I'm referring to? Gestationally.
Yes.
Is where I'm going
this
with that.
Brings us to you mentioned your blood type and so on. This brings us to the most common kind of blood type, ABO, which is a fascinating example of Mendel's ideas of inheritance. Probably parts of the human race develop these different blood types in different parts of the world. So, for instance, I think that most Native Americans in pre-Columbian times were all type O and this Rh positive. Then the wider variation has occurred in other parts of the world. But there are things that can go wrong. These blood types are incompatible, and if you try to mix them, then it often results in the death of the red blood cells. And so this can happen during gestation in the mother's womb.
And that's because the placenta uterine barrier is not perfect. You can get antibodies leaking across and or proteins going the other way. And so a mother who is Rh negative, who mates with a father who's Rh positive and has a gestating child that's Rh positive, her immune system can become sensitized to that Rh positive, and that can cause, in extreme cases, it can cause miscarriage, death of the child. Now that's reduced fertility. And if that kind of reduced fertility, which exists in humans, if it were to grow somewhat stronger because of changes in the immune system or the Rh factor, the whole human population could potentially split into two groups that can't breed with each other, and it would be driven by just one protein. And I'm hypothesizing a stronger immune reaction, of course.
Just as an aside here, there was a time when this Rh factor was a very important thing to consider, but in my lifetime, in more recent years, the medical community has developed a drug which can suppress the effects of the Rh factor attacking the developing and the newborn child.
Mm-hmm. And, well, that's one of these wonderful things that modern medicine brings us. And we get it, of course, by understanding how the living creatures work. I must admit, as a physicist, I'm often amazed at how good a job the biologists do. Richard Dawkins was talking to Neil deGrasse Tyson, on a show, and Dawkins was very deferential to Tyson and referred to him as practicing the hard science. And I couldn't help but think that if I had been there, I would have said, Mr. Dawkins, your subject is much more difficult because of the complexity of living things. After all, in physics, we make things simpler. We take them apart to understand them. If you take apart a living thing, it's no longer a living thing.
Good point. Good point.
All right. Well, I want to see if there are a few other topics we had here to talk about. I talked about the ring species, and I think what we can do is we can take our little message break at this point and talk about some upcoming events. And I'll thank you, Jonas, for helping me here. And when we come back from the break, viewers, we're going to be, I'll be sharing the stage here with Larry Rhodes. All right? So let's talk about the sponsors of this program. It's the it's the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. And in case you're just tuning in, in this program we're celebrating Darwin Day 2011. Darwin's birthday is, I believe, the 12th of February, and it's happening. And so this week there are celebrations going on actually worldwide. But interestingly enough, Darwin Day was created and conceived here in Tennessee at the University of Tennessee by the evolutionary biologists who teach right here. And you can follow that link on the screen for to go to the Darwin Day website at the University of Tennessee. All right. Well, also we want to talk about Camp Quest of the Smokies. Camp Quest of the Smokies is a fun summer school adventure organized initially by the Rationalists of East Tennessee, and it's kind of growing up on its own. Jonas, who was recently hosting with us, is one of the organizers of this. And since we're on the subject of Darwin and therefore biology, we snagged some scenes from last summer's program, and here you can see some youngsters actually extracting their own DNA using some simple, safe elementary chemistry. It's done with dishwashing detergent and I think some rubbing alcohol.
They went on to clone a few people, didn't they?
Not quite yet. That technology hasn't been fully worked out at Camp Quest of the Smokies. Okay. All right. Well, welcome here, Larry, and thank you for joining me.
Mm-hmm. It's good to be here for Darwin Day. Viewers, you can call in and tell us about the arguments that you have for or against Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. That would be great. Phone lines are open, 215-2288. Call anytime.
All right. Well, let's take missing links. Evolutionary theory predicts that there are gaps in the known fossil record, which gets the creationist shorts all in knots. Mm-hmm. You know, they talk about, that there are no missing links. But Darwin addressed it by talking about the fact that the opportunity to become a fossil is rare.
Very rare.
As well as the geologic evidence shows that with the passage of huge amounts of time, there's the opportunity for fossils to be destroyed by natural actions.
Living tissue and even bone will just wear away to nothing if left out to the elements. It has to be a pretty specific set of conditions to be able to form a fossil.
Generally fast burial in an environment without oxygen. Mm-hmm. But I would like to say that the same creationists who pointed all the gaps in the fossils and say, well, you can't explain these gaps, they've never once offered to point me a continuous history back of graves back to Noah, much less Adam.
Or put forward any evidence of their own that creation is actually true. That it all poofed into being at one particular time in the history of the world.
Well, and in fact, the fossil evidence shows that, there are vast deposits that have a limited range of living creatures. When you go find fossil evidence or fossil beds that have large amounts of dinosaur bones, you do not find elephant bones in there.
Or rabbit bones or any.
So, to say that a flood did it that's a pretty amazing flood. It's kind of got to sort it all, and
a lot of people are asking, especially creationists, say, well, what could we actually come up with that would disprove it? You say all of the stuff that we give you that wouldn't disprove it. There was a famous biologist recently said a rabbit in the Precambrian stone, would do it.
That's right.
And because the theory of evolution by natural selection would not predict it being there. It would throw serious questions into the whole mix of evolution. We've never found anything like that. The Cambrian explosion, look it up on the web, was the time in the world where life exploded onto the surface of the Earth.
Technically, it happened a little later than that. What happened in the Cambrian is
you're talking about multicellular life.
Greater diversity of fossil types. Mm-hmm. And I think what happened in the Cambrian is that probably the chemistry of the ocean and the atmosphere changed to allow many kinds of creatures that already exist to develop hard parts, and thus they fossilize more readily.
Right.
Right here in East Tennessee, we're fortunate that there are lots of fossils around us, and from the older time period called the Paleozoic, the Cambrian being one of those, and you can find trilobites in deposits over near the Kingston steam plant where the two twin smokestacks are. Beautiful little trilobites, about the size of a quarter. But, once again, you don't find shark's teeth in there because vertebrates, complex vertebrates like that with hard bones didn't exist yet.
One thing viewers can do is go online and look at the geology of the Yellowstone, or the Grand Canyon, excuse me. And it gives layer by layer by layer the different kinds of fossils that you can see going back into time. And you'll see that the more complex life are at the higher levels and the more primitive life are at the lower levels. And there are things called index fossils. Do you remember those? Would you like to talk about those a little bit?
Well, index fossils are fossils that, through basically trial and error, have been found to be characteristic of a narrow time zone. And so when you find those fossils, you know that the deposit you're looking at...
It's just another way of aging the dirt that it's in, or the stone that it's in.
Now, of course, that's not taken as gospel. That would be circular arguments. They also look at other things you can measure, and if you find an index out of its range, then you've got to say, well, we can't use that one as an index anymore.
Right. But the thing about it is, if they find them out of the range, it's very rare, because the reason that they're called index fossils is because they've been found in that range for so many different locations on the Earth that whenever they find them, they pretty much say, this is it. But they may go ahead and do other testing to confirm that cross-confirm that the age of the rock is that age.
Well, in the 20th century, scientists developed radiometric dating methods. But in the 19th century, when Darwin was working, they didn't have those, and so they had to rely on methods that don't have the same kind of precision we're used to today. They would look at the number of layers they would see in deposits and make assumptions like, well, if these were annual layers, how much time does this represent?
Right.
As well as they would look at how thick some of these fossil beds could be. Darwin himself, in Origin of Species, makes mention of a particular fossil bed which he alleges is I'm gonna say it's like 2 miles in depth, and for which the fossils within it don't vary much. So that represents a tremendous amount of time, and organisms were not changing during that. And what it does mean is that
they were well suited to the environment that they lived in.
And not merely that, it's indication of the fact that there are vast amounts of time going on for organisms to change that we're blind to because we don't happen to have 2-mile thick sedimentary deposits for all time.
Well, this also speaks to the many questions of the creationists who say, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Well, the monkeys that were still in the environment that they developed in or evolved in, the environment hasn't changed that much, so as long as the environment stays the same, the organism pretty much stays the same. It's when the environment changes that forces the speciation, forces evolution by natural selection to take place. And
what we would also find is if we could go back and look at the last common ancestor between, let's say, humans and chimpanzees, our nearest relative, it would be a creature that's not a chimpanzee, and it's not a human. It's something different, and it's not necessarily halfway in between.
Right.
It's a question of which of us have evolved maybe faster.
Right. Well, one thing about it is a chimpanzee today is only a chimpanzee because we see this creature and give it a phylum or whatever and say this is a chimpanzee. But all creatures are in flux. All creatures are between this creature and that creature. When creationists say, show me an evolutionary gap,
a
missing link, or they use a word for it, I can't think of the word. But the thing about it is...
transitional fossil.
Yes, show me a transitional fossil. Every fossil is a transitional fossil because it's along the path of evolution from the old creature to the new creature, and that's just happens to be a picture in time of that particular
when that individual was died and was preserved. In fact, the sad, kind of ironic thing is that most fossils are actually transitions between a living ancestor and extinction. Something like 99% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct.
There have been several extinction periods in the world history.
Well, the geological time
And we're not
scale,
talking about the Great Flood.
the geological time scale is named by geologists with several characteristic names, and a lot of these periods have a duration of about 50 million years. There isn't an explanation for that. There's hypotheses which are not tested and therefore not thought of as theories. They're just guesses. One of them might be that the Earth moves through bands of greater and lesser concentration of interstellar stars and dust as we orbit around the galaxy with something like a 50-year period. This could create
50,000 years? 50 million?
50 million years. And this could create more opportunities for comets to be dislodged from the Oort cloud in the outer solar system and come in and bombard the Earth.
Inner solar system.
And so this 50 million year periodicity is the reason behind it is not well understood. It's not related to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. That has a very different characteristic.
Right. And we're not talking about complete revolutions around the galaxy either. That takes about a quarter of a million years. Quarter of a billion years.
Yeah, it's about 250 million
But
years.
we're talking about moving from places in the rings, from one place in the ring through a ring, or through
a spiral arm.
Into another gap in between.
Yeah.
And that could be loaded with dark matter and therefore cover the, it could not only throw comets into the inner solar system because of the Oort cloud, but the material that makes up the dark matter that's floating out there, dust, debris, clouds, could actually come between the sun and the planets.
It is an interesting question to ask. Has the
Maybe
sun's strength changed, either intrinsically,
causing an ice age or something,
or other things? In fact, the Cambrian explosion, which Jonas and I talked about earlier, was immediately preceded by an event called the Snowball Earth. The Snowball Earth is a hypothesis that's become received somewhat firmer foundation only in the past 10 years. And the evidence is on the order of 700 to 600 million years ago that at least all of the land surface of the Earth was covered
glaciation.
with glaciation.
Completely covered the Earth.
When you ask the question, does that imply that the oceans were glaciated or not? The answer is, I think they can't really say with confidence, because you don't get scratches on rocks in the ocean, meaning there's nothing there to capture the scars like you can get when glaciers move across the rocky surface of the Earth.
But all this talk about fossils, if we took every fossil that was ever discovered in the history of man and put them in the lake, threw them in the ocean, we'd still have DNA evidence for evolution. That by itself would prove that evolution is true. There's such overwhelming evidence for evolution that scientists are not at all up in the air about it. You'll hear
there's no controversy.
There's no controversy. The controversy may be on the methods at which it works. Whether some things are more prevalent than others in evolution,
or if this particular two sets of fossils were still maybe interbreeding, or that they were separate
species. It's in the
species.
details, but not in the concept. The concept itself is accepted throughout the world.
In fact, we can say, for viewers who didn't hear us earlier, that evolution, the fact that biological creatures have changed, that's a fact. We can observe it by observing the evidence that their preserved remains leaves. Darwin's theory of change by random variation and natural selection is an explanation for how it happens. What are the physical processes that constrain how it can happen?
And even though he didn't get every detail right, he didn't know anything about DNA evidence or chromosomal changes. He got a lot of it right, and the very fact that he came up with the theory at all in his time was amazing.
Yeah. Oh, I've read Origin of Species, and I must say it is amazing to read what he says and the conclusions he draws from the evidence that he was aware of, and I just marvel at how right he was. Of course, time passes, and we now know so much more with the advent of technology of optical microscopes improving, and then in the 20th century, electron microscopes, so that we can see incredible detail. And then here in the late part of the 20th century, humans have learned to read the genetic code and have made a record of the entire genetic code.
For a human.
I see we have a caller here. Let's, Larry, introduce our caller, or meet our caller.
Hello, welcome to Freethought Forum. May I have your name or a nickname?
Yes, my name is Shara, and I see you gentlemen are talking about Darwin Day, and I've always been curious about Darwin's own religious affiliation. I understand he was born into a religious family, but do you know whether or not his studies and his writings turned him into an atheist or contributed to his losing his faith in his later life?
He was the son of a preacher, wasn't he?
His father was actually a doctor. And he began, Darwin went to school originally to study medicine, but he had a squeamish stomach. He couldn't stand the sight of blood and, I think, other creatures in pain. And so he switched to theology. He actually studied theology for some time. But he had a wide-ranging education that included also the natural sciences.
And he wanted to be a naturalist, so he booked a passage on the Beagle.
So when the opportunity for him to travel the world on the Beagle occurred, he jumped on it. But when he set foot on the Beagle, he was still a believer in the ideas of Christian faith. And it was the evidence he saw during the course of his journey and the evidence he gathered during that and after it that made him think that he really believed that the earth could not be young, like 6,000 years, like the Bible implies. The geology around him showed him that, and the variation in life really drove that home.
And his wife, what was his name? Her name?
Oh, goodness, I misplaced her life. That could be it.
Anyway, she was always in a turmoil over his studies and where it was leading him. He actually suppressed the publication of his book for 20 years while he struggled with the question of theology and human origins and natural origins.
Well, has there ever been anything written about him declaring a change in his faith after this trip and writing the book and holding off the publication? Did he ever acknowledge that he no longer was a believer?
I believe that one of Darwin's friends, Mr. Huxley, coined the term agnosticism. Agnosticism is it's used differently by different people, but I think Huxley and probably Darwin would have said that well, we can't say that we have enough information to know that there isn't a God.
Right.
And I think that would be the way Darwin would have described it.
At most, he would have died a deist. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the lady who had the deathbed confession or claimed to have one?
From Darwin?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to sign off, gentlemen, and let you take some more callers.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and Shara.
No, there was a very religious lady in the neighborhood who got a visit to the home toward the end of his life, and when she came back and wrote her article about it, she claimed that he renounced all of his studies and died a Christian. But we know that's not true from Darwin's own sister.
Yeah, similar stories are told about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, was ill and knew he was dying, and some preachers came to visit him, and he scolded them and told them to go away. Mm-hmm. But once again, something like 20 years after the fact, a neighbor claimed to have visited him and taken his confession.
And why would religious people lie like that? Lying for Jesus, I guess.
Well, I think it's hard for them to understand that people have very sincere doubts about the things that they sincerely believe.
Yeah, but the thing about it is they're putting forward something that they know is false. It's actually a lie.
Yeah.
I forget who the religious leader was, said that a good lie is one that brings people to Christ. So you could have a good lie even though it's against the commandment. Rationalization knows no bounds.
Well, and that goes exactly against the whole point about science. And the cool thing about science, of course, is that in principle, you don't have to take anyone's word for things. You can go verify it. So when I say gravity works where massive objects are attracted to one another, you can demonstrate it.
Even not massive objects.
It's not so massive. There are some things in science that are a little bit harder. So, for instance, if we say, well, do meteors fall from the sky? Are they rocks that fall from the sky? If I had one here, you could say to me, well, how can you prove that fell from the sky? And this particular one, maybe I couldn't prove it fell from the sky. But what we can do is we can say, well, on any given night, you can look up and see meteors. And
well, it depends on the composition of the ore in it, too. If it's very heavy iron and nickel, then we would say the chances are good that it fell from the sky.
Okay. Well, we have another caller. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Freethought Forum. Can you give us a name or a nickname and tell us what you think about Darwin Day?
Yes. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, I'm a geologist, and so I definitely have studied and think Darwin was, on to the truth. But I also, believe that there is a intelligence that has created the universe, and I don't see any contradiction. That I see the guiding hand of this creative intelligence, but it's just been over billions and eons of years. It just hasn't been.
Caller, I didn't get your name.
John.
John, how old would you say the Earth is?
The theory says billions. I don't know. I wasn't there.
Okay, but I wasn't here 100 years ago, and yet I can learn from things around me that the Earth is certainly more than 100 years old.
Detectives aren't on the premises at the time of a murder, but they can figure out who did it. And as a geologist, I would think that you would have studied this and know the evidences for the age of the Earth.
Oh, yeah. Well, in geology, we do a lot of theory. To say this is 700 million years old or 800 million years, that's splitting hairs. But I definitely believe Darwin did a great contribution to science, and I just don't see why people get all upset with his teachings, because unless you just interpret the God created the world in 6 days thing, that's 6 days can be 6 ages, or 6 eons. It's just I've never had a problem with creationism and science being in harmony.
Well, so John, let's talk about that 6 days or 6 ages thing. If you read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you'll find that the order in which some of the things happen is inconsistent between the two. So what that means is at least one of them can't be right, just due to logical inconsistencies. But if you take, I believe it's in Genesis 2, and you'll see that on day 3 that all of the plants were created. And if that represents a long age, a huge long age, well, then it's a little hard, to swallow that when on day 4 the sun and the moon are created. And
that you had 3 days before the sun was created. I mean, how did you have morning and night and all that stuff before the sun came around? But the thing about it is,
I'll have to reread my Genesis, but I didn't. I thought it started out with the sun being there. The light, it says in the beginning, where the sort of the cosmic, the Big Bang is actually, if you read John in the New Testament, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and all things were created from that. That's really the Big Bang theory, just put into more. Remember, we're talking somatic.
You can say it's the Big Bang theory, but then you gotta jibe the rest of it with known scientific facts, and you can't. I mean, just saying that the Big Bang is, let there be light is the Big Bang theory, it's quite a leap to say the rest of it is true too.
Yeah. It doesn't follow that if you say, well, okay, the Big Bang is let there be light, because really the Big Bang has got a whole lot more detail than that. And what's more is there is no evidence that I know of that says that matter and energy came into existence at the Big Bang. What the Big Bang is it represents a period of time about 13.7 billion years ago when the universe was much denser. Now, if it had if things were going on before that high density state, much like when you take water and you heat it up so that it's steam, all the molecules get randomized. You can't tell where one was. If it had been an iceberg prior to you heating it up and making it steam, by the time it's steam, you can't ever tell what the shape of that iceberg that it may have come from looked like. Do you follow that reasoning?
Yeah,
even in the Big Bang, it wasn't even atoms. It was like pre-atomic quarks and leptons and photons.
So,
it wasn't even atoms.
Well, now, remember one thing about now I'm not a physicist, but I've watched the History Channel talk about this, and as I understood the Big Bang is that sort of from nothingness sprang out a rapid expansion into form
John,
of matter.
John, the Big Bang is often described, especially by lay people, that way. But, you cannot find any equation or something like that where someone predicts how nothing makes something. You cannot find any experimental test where nothing makes something. And the Big Bang is best really described as a prior condition of the universe where it was in high density. And whether it started out as zero size and infinite density prior to that, or if it merely went through kind of like the narrow point in an hourglass and is expanding again, we can't tell from any physical evidence we currently have.
And we were talking about Darwin Day and evolution, and the Big Bang really has nothing to do with that. There's another whole step in there in between called abiogenesis. How did life begin? So you got to talk about the beginning of the universe. You got to talk about how life began, even before you ever get to evolution.
Yeah, certainly one of the important things to talk about with respect to evolution is the common ancestry that we all have, and a phrase that Darwin uses throughout Origin of Species is that the patterns we see in living creatures are the patterns that we would infer from common ancestry, inheritance. And he contrasts that with what he refers to as special creation. Because, of course, in Genesis 1 and 2, you hear that God created things that made offspring after their kind. And that's rather a statement that says that they were created separately, special creation. So Darwin is making a very firm stand that special creation in the Bible is wrong. All right. Did you have any more questions for us?
One more question, and again, it's interesting. It is hard to know origins and how, when we're talking back, again, we don't quite know the history of Knoxville 100 years ago fully. We know some things, but when we talk about, this happened 500 million years ago, this happened a billion years ago, it's all we can do is just give our best scientific estimation, I guess is the way I would put it. But my second question is, I've heard Darwin was a vegetarian, and I haven't studied his life fully. Is that true?
I don't know.
I'm not sure. I know that Darwin probably picked up some tropical parasitic diseases, and in a day and age when we didn't know how to treat those things. And so after his 5-year or so voyage on the Beagle, he was never in really good health again. And so he may have done things with unusual diets to try and mitigate that. He did live, I think, into his 80s, but he suffered badly from, I think, some gastrointestinal and maybe blood-borne parasites.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well,
listen, I'm going to go. Thank you for your program, and y'all have a great day.
all right. Well, thank you. All right. Well, we talked a little bit about missing links, and I don't know, did we ever get the slide up for one of the coolest missing links that was discovered? I think it's pronounced
Tiktaalik.
Tiktaalik.
Tiktaalik, I think.
This is a great example of how science is predictive. From the fossil evidence, you could see that in the late Paleozoic, there were creatures, there were fishes in the sea, and then in the early Mesozoic, well, there were creatures on the land. So there needed to be a transitional creature, and the transitional period had to be somewhere around 380 or so million years ago.
Right. With the body of knowledge that the scientists and geologists, biologists have accumulated over the history of biology or biologic study, they knew pretty much where these stones would be found and what to look for.
And Sam, if we could advance the slide, we're looking for the one that says missing link. Okay, so what this shows, I guess back over my head here, is a time scale, and it shows the time scale around 380 million years ago where there were fishes without limbs, and then 370 million years or so ago where there were creatures on the land.
And they knew the type of environment that they would have to live in to come ashore.
So then what they did is they went to the geologists and said, all right, where are there outcroppings on the surface of the Earth that were aquatic and are of that time frame? And they found this place, Esmeralda Island, there up over your head, which is in northern Canada. And they went to that place off and on for several years and found fossiliferous deposits, and lo and behold, they discovered that great fossil.
Tiktaalik.
So if we could back up one slide, we can actually see.
There you go.
So there over my head is the actual fossil. This is a creature with a great big triangular kind of head, and he had fins that were articulated and had actually a wrist, so he could kind of do a push-up.
Right.
He could still swim with those fins, but he could begin to get out on land. And evolutionary biologists predicted, when that had to happen. The geologists helped figure out where the strata would be. So
and they went there and they found it.
So if the creationists want to prove evolution wrong, they need to prove that Tiktaalik happens in all other geologic strata as well. Well, we're getting near the end of the time here. Can you start our closing up here?
Sure. Get your pen out and paper if you want to write to us. You can write to us at freethoughtforum@yahoo.com. If you need to order back copies of the show, you can do that.
You can call in this number here and ask for back copies. They will burn discs for you.
They may put 3 or 4 shows on a single disc for you for a single order.
All right. Well, Larry, this has been Freethought Forum with Faithless Forrest.
Larry Rhodes.
And we want to thank Jonas, who helped us earlier, and Sam, who's
on the camera,
doing the technical things, and all of our callers for calling in and speaking to us about Darwin Day.
And the Earth is over 4 billion years old.
All right. Happy birthday, Darwin.
Happy birthday, Darwin.
Okay.